Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we step back into a world of shining temples, vast markets, and a city rising from the waters of a great lake. At its heart stood its capital city, Tenochtitlan, which was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was powerful, complex, and alive with movement. And yet, in what feels like the briefest moment in history, it all began to fall apart. This is a story of ambition and misunderstanding, of alliances that shifted the balance of power, of unseen forces that moved faster than armies. It is a story where courage meets uncertainty, where decisions ripple outward, and where an entire empire faces a future it could never have imagined. As we move through this journey, you may find yourself wondering how something so vast could change so quickly, and how the echoes of that moment still shape the world today. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your body soften. Allow your eyes to grow heavy. And let your mind unwind as this remarkable story slowly unfolds. Let's begin. The Aztec Empire fell in barely 2 astonishing years. From the moment Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast in 1519 to the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the collapse came with astonishing speed. That is part of what makes this story so gripping. Empires are supposed to fade slowly. They are supposed to crack over generations, with warning signs, border losses, and long decline. This one seemed to stand in dazzling strength, then suddenly faced strangers from across the sea, uprisings among old enemies, political shock, siege, famine, and disease in the space of 2 years. For the people living through it, the world must have felt as if it had tilted almost overnight. A system of tribute, warfare, and ceremony that had taken decades to build was thrown into crisis with terrifying force. That speed is one reason the conquest still feels so unreal. It did not unfold like a slow sunset. It came like a storm. Tenochtitlan was one of Earth's greatest cities when it fell. Long before its destruction, the Aztec capital was already one of the wonders of the world. Built on islands in Lake Texcoco, it astonished visitors with broad causeways, canals crowded with canoes, towering temples, and markets filled with food, cloth, flowers, tools, and luxury goods from across central Mexico. This was not a rough frontier town waiting to be civilized. It was a vast, organized metropolis with aqueducts, ceremonial spaces, schools, and neighborhoods alive with trade and ritual. Some Spaniards compared it to the greatest cities of Europe, and even then the comparison hardly captured the strangeness of a city rising from water. Imagine approaching it for the first time and seeing white buildings gleaming above the lake, with mountains beyond and thousands of people moving through streets and canals. Its fall shocks us more because the place itself was so magnificent. An ordinary city would not hold history like this one does. A tiny Spanish force could never have won alone. One of the biggest surprises in this story is that the conquest was never a simple tale of a few hundred Spaniards defeating millions by themselves. That version is dramatic, but it hides the far more fascinating truth. Cortés survived and advanced because thousands upon thousands of indigenous allies joined him. Some offered intelligence. Some carried supplies. Some fought in enormous numbers beside the Spaniards. Without them, the newcomers would have remained stranded outsiders in a dangerous land they barely understood. They did not know the politics, the roads, the rivalries, or the terrain well enough to conquer anything on their own. The force that brought down the empire was not just Spanish steel. It was a coalition held together by ambition, resentment, fear, and opportunity. That makes the fall more complex and more human. It was not one world overpowering another in a single stroke. It was many worlds colliding at once, with deadly consequences. The empire was shattered by enemies it had once conquered. The Aztec Empire inspired fear, but it also bred deep resentment. Many cities under its power were forced to deliver tribute in goods, labor, and captives, while living under the constant threat of military punishment if they resisted. That meant the empire stood on strength, but also on anger, waiting for the right moment. When the Spaniards entered central Mexico, they stepped into a political landscape already full of old wounds. Rival states and subject peoples did not need much encouragement to imagine a different future. Some saw a chance to break free. Others saw an opportunity to strike back at a power that had humiliated them for years. This is one of the most gripping turns in the story, because it reveals that the empire's greatest danger was already inside its world. The invaders did not create all the fractures. They found them, widened them, and used them with ruthless skill until the whole structure began to give way. Smallpox struck before many Aztecs even understood the threat. Not every weapon in this conquest had a blade, a bow, or a gunpowder spark. One of the deadliest arrived invisibly. Smallpox spread into central Mexico with horrifying force, tearing through communities that had no previous exposure and no inherited protection against it. People could not bargain with it, fight it, or flee from it in any reliable way. It struck nobles and commoners, warriors and children, and in a crowded world linked by roads, markets, and tribute routes, it could move with terrifying speed. The disease weakened whole communities before the final struggle for the capital was even complete. It also killed leaders at the worst possible moment, adding confusion to catastrophe. That is one reason the story feels so chilling. A mighty empire was not only facing foreign enemies, it was also being attacked by something no one could see, explain fully, or stop. History changed because a virus crossed an ocean. The final battle was fought in a city floating on water. Most famous last stands happen in fortresses, mountain passes, or walled cities on dry ground. Here, the struggle unfolded in a place unlike any battlefield most people could imagine. Tenochtitlan stood in a lake, connected to the mainland by causeways and threaded with canals that could serve as streets, supply routes, or killing grounds. That setting shaped everything. Fighters moved by canoe. Bridges could be torn down to block an advance, then rebuilt under fire. A retreat could become a plunge into dark water. Defenders knew how to use the city's channels and gaps in the roads to trap enemies in chaos. Attackers had to think not just like an army on land, but like a force trying to master an urban maze half made of water. It is one of the reasons the siege feels so vivid. This was not simply the fall of a capital. It was the destruction of an island world built to dazzle and defend. Cortés conquered an empire by turning its neighbors against it. Cortés did not arrive with enough soldiers to overwhelm the Aztec world by force alone, so he leaned on something just as powerful: political manipulation. He listened, bargained, threatened, promised, and adjusted constantly. He recognized that the empire's surrounding states were not passive spectators. They were players with memories, grievances, fears, and ambitions of their own. By presenting himself as a possible ally against Tenochtitlan, he transformed foreign invasion into a struggle many local groups believed they could use to their advantage. This required more than luck. It required reading people quickly and exploiting division without mercy. The brilliance and the horror lies in how effectively he used local rivalries as stepping stones toward the center of power. He was not simply marching forward. He was rearranging the political map as he went. The conquest becomes far more fascinating when you see it this way, as a campaign won not only with weapons, but with calculated persuasion. Moctezuma welcomed strangers who would soon cage him. Few moments in history feel as charged as the meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés. The emperor ruled a powerful state and presided over one of the great capitals of the age, yet he chose to admit these unfamiliar newcomers into the heart of his world. We still debate exactly what he believed, feared, or hoped to achieve. Perhaps he wanted to control the situation through ceremony and hospitality. Perhaps he was buying time. Perhaps the sheer uncertainty of the moment made every choice dangerous. Whatever his reasoning, the gamble failed spectacularly. The guests he received with formal splendor soon took him captive inside his own city. That reversal is astonishing. A ruler surrounded by wealth, warriors, and sacred authority found himself turned into a hostage by men who had entered as outsiders. It feels almost impossible, and that is why it lingers in the mind. One decision at the center of an empire became the hinge on which history swung. The fall of Tenochtitlan remade the history of the Americas. When the Aztec capital fell, the event did not remain a local tragedy. It opened the way for a colonial order that would reshape an entire continent. From the ruins of Tenochtitlan rose Mexico City, a new Spanish center of power built directly over the old imperial heart. From there came new systems of government, religion, labor, taxation, and language that would spread across vast territories. Wealth, drawn from conquered lands, would feed Spain's global ambitions, while indigenous communities across the region would face profound upheaval. This is why the story matters so much. It is not only the end of one empire. It is the beginning of a transformed Americas, with consequences that still echo in culture, identity, memory, and politics today. The past did not end when the city fell. It changed shape. The world before and the world after were not the same. Few single events can claim that kind of power over the centuries that followed. An island capital became the stage for an empire's destruction. There is something unforgettable about the setting of this final collapse. The Aztec Empire did not end in a distant province or on an empty plain. It ended in its ceremonial and political heart, surrounded by water, crowded with temples, homes, causeways, markets, and shrines. Every fight took place in a city loaded with meaning. This was where rulers were enthroned, tribute was gathered, gods were honored, and imperial power was displayed at its most dazzling. So when war consumed it, the destruction was not merely military. It was symbolic in the deepest sense. Streets people knew by memory became battlegrounds. Sacred spaces became targets. Familiar routes for trade and worship became paths of fear, hunger, and death. That is what gives the fall its emotional force. The empire watched its own center break apart. The stage was not just where the drama happened. The stage itself was part of what was being destroyed. The Aztec Empire ruled through tribute, fear, and fragile alliances. At its height, the empire did not govern every community in the same direct way a modern state might. Instead, it extended power through a network of submission, obligation, and warning. Conquered towns were expected to send cotton, cacao, feathers, food, weapons, and luxury goods into the imperial center on a regular schedule. Local rulers often stayed in place, but they stayed there under pressure. Behind every demand stood the memory of military punishment. Behind every ceremony stood the possibility of force. This system could look efficient from the outside because wealth kept flowing and provincial elites often cooperated. Yet it depended on constant balance. Too much pressure could spark revolt. Too little could invite defiance. The brilliance and danger of the empire lay in that tension. It was not held together by affection. It was held together by performance, intimidation, and bargains that lasted only as long as imperial power seemed too strong to challenge. Many subject cities hated paying wealth into Tenochtitlan. For the capital, tribute was proof of greatness. For many communities forced to send it, tribute was a draining burden that never seemed to end. Goods that represented labor, harvest, skill, and local pride were gathered and moved outward to enrich distant rulers and ceremonies. Imagine weaving fine cloth or growing valuable crops, only to watch a large share taken away because your city had once been defeated in war. That kind of arrangement could create obedience, but it rarely created loyalty. It also meant resentment lived in practical things. It lived in the baskets of maize, the loads of cacao, the feathers, garments, and ornaments carried away from the people who made them. These were not abstract taxes on paper. They were visible reminders of who commanded and who obeyed. By the time the Spaniards arrived, many communities had years of frustration stored up. The empire collected wealth, but it also collected grudges. The empire looked mighty, but resentment simmered beneath it. From a distance, imperial strength seemed overwhelming. Armies marched. Tribute arrived. Rulers displayed authority through ceremony, architecture, and war. Yet beneath that grandeur lay a more unstable reality. Many subject peoples had reasons to fear the empire, but they also had reasons to hate it. Families remembered defeats. Local leaders remembered humiliation. Whole communities remembered what it meant to lose autonomy while still being expected to support the power that dominated them. This is what makes the empire so fascinating at the moment of contact. It was not a hollow shell, yet it was not as secure as its magnificence suggested. The surface was polished and imposing. The deeper layers were full of pressure. When a new force appeared from the coast, that pressure suddenly found direction. Old anger that had remained dangerous but contained could now attach itself to an opportunity. The empire still looked solid, but much of the loyalty holding it together was brittle. Tlaxcala became the alliance that changed everything. Few partnerships in history altered events so dramatically. Tlaxcala had resisted Aztec domination for years and remained one of the most important enemies of Tenochtitlan in central Mexico. When Cortés first encountered the Tlaxcalans, the meeting did not begin in friendship. There was hard fighting, testing, and bloodshed. That makes what followed even more extraordinary. After combat, both sides recognized a larger possibility. The Spaniards needed a powerful local partner. Tlaxcala needed a chance to strike at a hated rival with fresh tools and dangerous newcomers at its side. Once that alliance formed, the conquest changed shape. The invaders were no longer isolated strangers on a risky march. They were connected to a determined indigenous power with manpower, supplies, intelligence, and a deep understanding of the political landscape. In many ways, this was the hinge of the whole campaign. Without Tlaxcala, the road to the imperial capital may never have opened at all. Cortés gained thousands of indigenous warriors, not just a few soldiers. Popular memory often shrinks the conquest into the image of a few armored men advancing alone, but the real force that moved through central Mexico was vastly larger and far more mixed. As Cortés advanced, he gathered allied fighters in the thousands. These warriors were not decorative additions trailing behind the Spaniards. They were essential to the campaign. They knew the terrain, brought local knowledge, carried supplies, scouted routes, and took part in the actual fighting on a scale the Spanish contingent alone could never match. Their presence transformed a foreign expedition into something much more formidable. It also changed the emotional shape of the conflict. For communities facing this coalition, The threat was not just a few strange outsiders. It was the sight of long-standing regional enemies arriving with them in enormous numbers. That would have made the danger feel immediate and personal. The conquest was not the tiny spear tip. It was a growing mass of alliances moving inland. The conquest was as much civil war as invasion. This is one of the most important ways to understand the fall of the empire. Foreign arrival mattered enormously, but what followed was not simply outsiders imposing themselves on a united land. Central Mexico was already full of rivalry, competition, memory, and unresolved conflict. When the Spaniards entered that world, they became part of a struggle that many indigenous peoples saw through their own political interests. That is why the campaign can feel less like a straightforward invasion and more like a regional war that expanded around new actors and new technologies. Communities chose sides. Some gambled on rebellion. Some aimed for survival. Some sought revenge for years of subordination. That does not make the conquest less violent or less devastating. It makes it more complex, and in many ways, more tragic. People were not only defending themselves against foreigners. Many were fighting old enemies while trying to reshape the future, only to help create a harsher world than they expected. Spain's greatest weapon was often indigenous political anger. Steel blades, horses, and gunpowder left strong impressions, but one of the deadliest advantages the Spaniards possessed was something they did not bring from Europe at all. They found it already present in the political landscape of central Mexico. Anger at Aztec domination gave them leverage far greater than their numbers. Communities that had been squeezed, threatened, or subordinated could see in the newcomers a chance to strike back. That did not mean trust. It meant calculation. It meant deciding that the old order had become so burdensome that alliance with dangerous strangers was worth the risk. Cortés was skilled at recognizing this feeling and turning it into momentum. Every fresh grievance he could tap became another opening. Every rival city that chose his side made the imperial center more vulnerable. That is what makes this conquest so startling. The force that undid the empire was not just metal and cavalry. It was accumulated resentment finally given a direction. Old rivalries became the road into the Aztec heartland. Cortés did not push inland through an empty map. He moved through a landscape already full of memory, status, insult, and unfinished conflict. Every region had relationships shaped by war, tribute, competition, or strategic fear. That meant the road to the capital was not defined only by distance. It was defined by politics. Groups who disliked or resisted Aztec power became stepping stones into deeper territory, not because they loved the Spaniards, but because rivalry made cooperation seem useful. Each old hostility that could be activated opened another path, another supply line, another source of fighters or information. In that sense, the march toward Tenochtitlan was built from inherited tensions. The invaders advanced not just because they were determined, but because central Mexico contained its own fault lines, and those fractures became routes of opportunity. It is a chilling idea. The empire's enemies had always been there. The strangers merely found a way to walk along lines already waiting to split. The empire's strength depended on keeping many enemies obedient. Some empires expand into lands they later integrate so fully that resistance fades for long periods. The Aztec system was different in a crucial way. It often left defeated peoples with their own local structures while demanding ongoing submission, tribute, and recognition of imperial dominance. That approach could produce impressive reach without requiring control over every detail of daily life. It also created constant risk. A city that obeyed today might be watching for weakness tomorrow. A ruler who performed loyalty in public might be measuring opportunities in private. This meant imperial strength was never only about victory in battle. It was about maintaining the impression that resistance would fail and obedience was wiser. Once that aura weakened, practical danger followed. Towns that had cooperated out of caution could rethink their position very quickly. In a system with many resentful subordinates, power had to be renewed again and again. The empire looked grand, but much of that grandeur rested on continued psychological pressure. Once that fear broke, the empire began to unravel. Fear can hold a political order together for a very long time, especially when punishment has been visible and effective. Yet once people begin to suspect that power is no longer absolute, the change can be sudden and dramatic. That is part of what happened in central Mexico. The empire had relied on the reputation of its armies, the weight of its demands, and the expectation that rebellion would bring consequences no city could survive alone. But once allies began joining the Spaniards and resistance seemed possible, that old certainty weakened. Fear stopped working with the same force. And once that happened, imperial control became harder to maintain in every direction at once. Communities that had endured domination out of caution could imagine alternatives. Rivals could sense openings. Defiance that once seemed unthinkable could become practical. This is one of history's great turning points, because the collapse did not begin only with battle. It began when the empire no longer felt invincible. Tenochtitlan rose from a lake like a vision. For people approaching the city, the first sight must have felt almost unreal. There, in the middle of Lake Texcoco, stood a great urban center with causeways, gleaming structures, temples, and moving traffic of canoes cutting across the water. European observers struggled to describe it because they had seen cities, but not one arranged like this. Indigenous visitors and traders knew its splendor in another way, as the ceremonial and political heart of a vast power. Water reflected buildings and sky. Mountains framed the basin. The approach itself became part of the city's drama, as if power had been staged on a grand natural platform. This matters because the capital was not merely large. It was visually unforgettable. It impressed itself on imagination before any ruler spoke or any market opened. When later generations think of the fall, they remember more than a military event. They remember that what fell was one of the most striking urban creations of its age. Causeways linked the city to the mainland like stone lifelines. Tenochtitlan's position in the lake gave it grandeur, but survival depended on carefully built routes connecting it to the shores around it. These causeways were not minor roads. They were essential arteries for movement, trade, communication, and defense. They allowed people, goods, and armies to pass across water in controlled directions. In peaceful times, they bound the city to the wider world that fed and sustained it. In wartime, they became choke points where every step could matter. Their importance makes them feel almost like engineered fate. If you controlled a causeway, you influenced access to the capital itself. If one was cut, movement narrowed and danger intensified. They were practical works of infrastructure, but also strategic lines on which the city's future could hinge. It is hard not to imagine the tension of those long raised roads stretching over water, beautiful in the daylight and terrifying when war turned them into contested paths toward the heart of an empire. Canals ran through the capital like watery streets. Inside the city, movement did not belong only to foot traffic on land. Water flowed through urban life itself. Canals served as routes for transport, trade, daily travel, and communication, giving the capital a rhythm unlike almost any other great city of its time. Canoes moved through neighborhoods carrying people, food, goods, and messages. That meant the city was not simply surrounded by water. It was internally shaped by it. The pattern of everyday life would have sounded different and felt different with paddles in motion, crossings, landings, and waterborne routes woven into the urban fabric. This made the city efficient and visually extraordinary, but it also meant that war within it could become especially complex. A fight might shift from street to canal and back again in moments. Movement itself required a different kind of knowledge. To understand the capital, you have to imagine a place where water was not a barrier on the edge, but part of the city's living skeleton. Markets there dazzled even the invaders who came to destroy it. The Greek market at Tlatelolco left a deep impression on those who saw it, including men who had come with conquest in mind. That tells you something important. Even in the middle of ambition and danger, the sheer scale and order of commercial life in the capital could force admiration. Here were vast crowds, organized spaces, specialist sellers, and a flow of goods that revealed the richness of the wider world tied to the city. Food, cloth, tools, ornaments, animals, pottery, and rare items passed through a system that seemed both immense and disciplined. This was not random bustle. It was the visible proof of urban confidence and economic reach. The market showed that the capital was not powerful only because it ruled. It was powerful because it gathered, exchanged, and organized abundance. That is part of why its destruction feels so tragic. A place of astonishing human energy was later turned into a site of hunger, fear, and ruin. The city's population rivaled the largest cities of Europe. One of the most surprising truths for many modern listeners is simple. The capital was not a minor city encountered on the edge of empire. It was one of the great urban centers of the world. In population, it stood beside some of the largest cities in Europe, which means the Spaniards were not facing a small settlement, but a dense, highly developed metropolis full of people, systems, and coordinated life. That scale changes everything in the imagination. It means crowded neighborhoods, constant movement, heavy demand for food and water, large ceremonial gatherings, and a level of organization that only major cities can sustain. It also means that when war and disease struck, the human consequences multiplied terribly. In a city so large, disruption could become disaster with frightening speed. To picture the fall properly, you must start with size. This was not the collapse of an outpost. It was the breaking of one of the largest and most impressive cities of its century. Temples towered over a metropolis built in the lake. The city's sacred architecture announced power long before any ruler needed to speak. Rising above the urban landscape were temple structures that dominated the skyline and reminded everyone who entered that religion, authority, and imperial identity were woven tightly together. The ceremonial center was not tucked away. It stood high and visible, shaping how the city looked and how it must have felt. These buildings were places of ritual, performance, offering, and political meaning. They anchored the capital in cosmic order, as the Aztec world understood it. When you imagine the city, you have to see not only homes, canals, and marketplaces, but also these towering sacred forms casting their presence over daily life. They helped turn the capital into something more than an administrative center. It became a spiritual stage for empire. That is one reason later destruction cut so deeply. To damage such spaces was not only to break stone, it was to attack the visible heart of a world. Chinampa farms helped feed one of the world's great capitals. A city as large as Tenochtitlan could not survive on beauty and ceremony alone. It needed food on a massive scale, and one of the most remarkable answers to that need was the Chinampa system. These cultivated plots, created in the shallow lake environment, were highly productive and helped support dense urban life nearby. They turned wetlands into a carefully managed agricultural landscape that could yield crops with impressive efficiency. This is one of the marvels of the Aztec world because it shows practical intelligence at the heart of imperial splendor. The city was not only dramatic in appearance. It was sustained by sophisticated environmental engineering and intense labor. Fields, water, transport, and urban consumption were all linked together in a delicate system. Once you understand that, the later siege becomes even more chilling. A city that depended on these surrounding lifelines could also be starved if those lifelines were severed. Its nourishment was part of its vulnerability. The city was beautiful, efficient, and dangerously exposed. There is a haunting paradox at the center of Tenochtitlan's design. The features that made it extraordinary also created distinct risks in time of war. Its location gave it grandeur, spectacle, and strategic advantages. Yet an island capital linked through limited access points and dependent on surrounding water systems could face terrible pressure if enemies adapted to that environment. Its orderliness, transport routes, and concentration of people made urban life work brilliantly in peace. In crisis, those same qualities could become liabilities. A city of breathtaking design had to be continually supplied. A city arranged through controlled routes could also be isolated. A city rising from the lake could be admired from afar, but it could also be encircled. That is why the fall feels so tragic and so fascinating. Tenochtitlan was not a flawed city that happened to collapse. It was a brilliant city whose very brilliance could not fully protect it once war, alliance, and siege closed in. To conquer the empire, the invaders had to master the lake. Marching to the capital was not enough. Even entering it was not enough. To defeat the imperial center completely, the attackers had to deal with the watery world that protected and sustained it. The lake was not background scenery. It was part of the city's defensive reality. Canoes could move men and goods quickly. Channels and open water complicated pursuit. The surrounding environment gave defenders mobility and familiarity that outsiders did not naturally possess. So conquest demanded adaptation. The invaders had to learn that control of roads alone would never fully decide the struggle. They needed command over the waters around the city as well. This is what makes the campaign so gripping. It forced the attackers to think beyond the habits of ordinary land war and reshape the battlefield to fit a place unlike any they had known. The empire's heart stood in a lake, and until that lake was challenged, the heart could not be fully seized. The capital's brilliance also made its fall more shocking. If Tenochtitlan had been ordinary, its destruction would still matter, but it would not carry the same force in the imagination. What gives the fall such enduring power is the contrast between splendor and ruin. The city was not only politically important, it was astonishing to behold, rich in symbolism, engineering, commercial life, sacred architecture, and urban confidence. That means the conquest did not simply remove a seat of power. It shattered something people recognized as magnificent. The emotional weight of the story comes partly from that reversal. A place built to impress, organize, and dominate became a place of wreckage and desperation within a short span of time. The sharper the brilliance, the sharper the shock. History is full of wars, but not every war destroys a city that seems to glow in the record long after it has vanished. This one did, and that is why the ending feels less like a conclusion than a wound history still remembers. Cortés first arrived as an outlaw defying his own governor. Before he ever faced the Aztec Empire, Cortés was already gambling against authority. He launched his expedition from Cuba under the shadow of disapproval from Governor Diego Velázquez, who had begun to fear his ambition and tried to rein him in. That meant the man marching toward Tenochtitlan was not simply a royal servant carrying out clear orders. He was already stepping beyond them. From the beginning, his campaign carried the energy of personal risk, calculated defiance, and restless self-invention. That matters because it tells you something about the kind of figure entering this story. He was not cautious. He was willing to stake everything on speed, audacity, and the hope that success would pardon disobedience. In a strange way, the conquest begins as an act of insubordination. One man broke from the chain that was supposed to control him, then hurled that rebellion across an ocean and into the center of an empire. He burned his escape and forced his men forward. One of the most dramatic moments in the campaign came when Cortés ensured that retreat would no longer feel like a real option. Rather than preserve the comforting possibility of sailing back in defeat, he had his ships rendered unusable. Whether remembered as burning or scuttling, the effect was the same. The sea route behind them was gone. For his men, this was terrifying and clarifying at once. It turned a dangerous expedition into a committed march with no easy reverse. Suddenly, every alliance mattered more. Every step inland carried greater weight. There would be no simple return to the coast after a setback. This act also reveals the psychology of Cortés. He understood that men fight differently when the path behind them has vanished. Fear can shatter resolve, but it can also harden it when there is nowhere else to go. In that sense, the conquest moved forward not only on ambition, but on deliberate desperation. The march inland was part gamble, part rebellion, part ambition. As Cortés pushed away from the coast, he was advancing into uncertainty on several levels at once. He did not fully know the forces waiting ahead. He did not know which peoples would resist, which would bargain, or which would turn into allies. He also carried the risk of political disaster behind him, because failure could leave him not just dead, but condemned as a defiant subordinate who had overreached spectacularly. Yet he moved anyway. That is what gives the march its electric quality. It was a military venture, but it also felt like a rolling wager against geography, against politics, and against fortune itself. Every mountain crossed and every embassy received became part of a larger test. Would audacity keep opening doors, or would it finally carry the Spaniards into a trap too deep to escape? The road to Tenochtitlan was not a smooth advance. It was a dangerous throw of the dice that kept winning just long enough. Each new alliance made the Spaniards harder to stop. At the start, the Spaniards were exposed, few in number, and operating in unfamiliar territory. But they changed shape as the campaign advanced. Every new partnership gave them fresh strength. More fighters meant more pressure in battle. More local support meant better supplies, more guides, more intelligence, and a clearer sense of which roads and rivalries could be used next. That is what made the conquest so unsettling. The force heading toward the Aztec heartland did not remain what it had been when it landed. It accumulated energy from the world it was moving through. With each agreement, the newcomers became less like isolated intruders and more like the center of a widening coalition. Stopping them early might have been possible. Stopping them later became much harder because they were no longer alone in any meaningful sense. The conquest gathered momentum like a storm front, fed by each community that decided the old balance of power might finally be broken. Translators made conquest possible long before swords did. Before armies can truly move through a foreign political world, they need words. They need meaning. They need someone who can turn suspicion into negotiation and confusion into action. That is why translators stand so close to the center of this story. Without them, the Spaniards would have remained trapped behind a wall of language, unable to ask for food, interpret warnings, receive envoys, or exploit rivalries. Translation did far more than pass information from one mouth to another. It made strategy possible. It allowed promises to be made, threats to be delivered, and intentions to be disguised when useful. In a campaign shaped by diplomacy as much as battle, language became infrastructure. It was the invisible road on which conquest traveled. That can be easy to overlook because steel and blood are more dramatic on the surface. Yet before a city could be attacked, a world had to be interpreted. The first openings came through speech, not through the edge of a blade. Malintzin became one of the most important voices in the campaign. Among the most remarkable figures in the entire conquest is the woman known as Malintzin, also called Donnea Marina. Through intelligence, memory, linguistic skill, and political instinct, she became indispensable to Cortés. She was not a background helper passing along simple phrases. She operated at the tense meeting point of cultures, intentions, and danger. Through her, messages could move between people who otherwise stood divided by enormous barriers. She helped explain motives, interpret tone, and navigate encounters where one wrong word could trigger violence. That made her presence powerful in ways that still startle modern listeners. Armies were marching, but a woman's voice stood near the center of events, shaping communication at crucial moments. Her role also reminds us that conquest was not driven only by captains and kings. It depended on individuals whose abilities could alter outcomes without commanding armies themselves. In a story full of steel and spectacle, language and intelligence could be just as decisive. Words, promises, and threats opened gates that cannons could not. It is tempting to imagine conquest as a simple sequence of battles, but much of this campaign moved forward through persuasion and pressure. Towns did not always need to be stormed when they could be swayed, divided, or frightened into cooperation. A well-timed promise of protection could matter. So could a warning about the fate of those who resisted. So could the suggestion that old enemies were already choosing a new side. In this way, speech became a weapon that could travel ahead of violence, and sometimes make violence easier when it finally arrived. The Spaniards did have striking military technologies, but cannons alone could not persuade a local elite to take a risk or convince a rival community that rebellion might succeed. Language could do that. It could unsettle, tempt, and rearrange loyalties. That is why the campaign feels so layered. Behind every clash of arms stood conversations that reshaped the ground first, often before a single shot or spear strike decided anything. Diplomacy often marched ahead of violence in the conquest. Again and again, embassies, meetings, gifts, warnings, and negotiations came before open fighting. This was not because the campaign was peaceful. It was because violence worked better when diplomacy had already softened the field. Cortés understood that every ruler, noble, or city council he encountered had fears and hopes that could be used. Some wanted safety. Some wanted advantage. Some wanted information before committing themselves. By engaging with them, the Spaniards could gather knowledge while also planting uncertainty. Would resistance be worth it if a neighboring power had already sided with the newcomers? Would loyalty to Tenochtitlan still be wise if the political landscape was shifting? This made diplomacy feel less like a pause between battles and more like an advance unit of conquest itself. It reached into communities before the army did. It probed for weakness. It invited betrayal. By the time violence erupted, part of the struggle had often already been fought in talk, suspicion, and calculated delay. Cortés knew how to turn uncertainty into advantage. One of his greatest strengths was not certainty, but his ability to operate inside uncertainty without freezing. He rarely had perfect information. He did not fully understand every custom, every local grudge, or every danger ahead. Yet he had a talent for making uncertainty work for him. When others hesitated, he acted quickly enough to create facts on the ground. When people were unsure of his intentions, he allowed that uncertainty to magnify his presence. When enemies did not know whether he was weak, lucky, or backed by even greater power, he benefited from their confusion. This was a campaign full of unknowns for everyone involved, not just for the Spaniards. Cortés exploited that shared instability with unusual skill. He sensed that people often make revealing choices when they are unsure what world they are entering. So he pressed, improvised, and forced decisions before the political dust could settle. In a trembling landscape, decisiveness became its own form of power. He entered the empire already planning to break it. Whatever courtesies were exchanged along the way, Cortés was not wandering toward the Aztec world in awe and uncertainty alone. He was studying it as something that could be dismantled. He looked for stress points. He noted rivalries. He observed how power flowed and where it might be disrupted. That is part of what makes his march so unnerving. Even when he was receiving gifts, holding meetings, or sending polite messages, he was also searching for the structure beneath the splendor. How was the empire held together? Which communities obeyed willingly, and which only endured? Which roots mattered most? Which leaders could be isolated? This mindset gave the campaign a cold, strategic edge. He was not simply reacting to events. He was already imagining how the system might be pulled apart piece by piece. By the time he approached the capital, he had done more than survive the journey. He had begun mentally mapping the destruction of an empire he had only just encountered. Moctezuma ruled a vast empire, but faced impossible choices. Power did not make Moctezuma's position simple. In some ways, it made it more difficult. He stood at the center of a large and demanding imperial system when news began arriving of strange men on the coast, armed with unfamiliar animals, weapons, and intentions. Every possible response carried danger. Ignore them, and the threat might grow unchecked. Attack too soon, and he might commit the empire to a conflict he did not yet understand. Welcome them, and he risked bringing danger into the heart of his own world. Delay could look weak. Aggression could backfire. This is what makes his story so compelling. He was not a man choosing between obvious good and obvious bad. He was trying to judge the unknown while responsible for an empire whose prestige had to be maintained at all times. We often see the outcome and assume the path should have been clear. For him, it was almost certainly a maze with no safe exit. The strangers arriving from the coast were unlike any threat before. The Aztec world knew war. It knew rival states, rebellious enemies, and shifting political danger. What arrived from the coast was different. These newcomers came from beyond the familiar map of expectation. They brought animals central Mexico had never seen used in war, weapons that sounded and flashed in startling ways, and bodies covered in metal that changed how they moved and fought. Just as important, they came from a political and cultural world that local rulers could not place easily within existing patterns. Were they raiders, envoys, wanderers, mercenaries, or something else entirely? That uncertainty made them harder to judge than a known rival. Even bad enemies become easier to manage once you understand their habits. The coastal strangers broke that advantage. Reports about them must have carried the atmosphere of rumor and disbelief, with every retelling adding wonder or dread. The empire was not facing a familiar storm. It was facing something that did not fit the old categories. Reports of horses and cannon sounded almost unbelievable. Imagine hearing that men were approaching on creatures that seemed part human rider and part beast in motion, or that weapons could hurl thunder, smoke, and tearing force across a battlefield. Even before many people saw the newcomers directly, descriptions of them were already shaping expectation. That matters because first contact is not only about what is real, it is also about what people think is real before they see it. Reports of horses and cannon would have traveled through listeners who were trying to fit the unfamiliar into a known world. Some details may have sounded exaggerated. Others may have sounded impossible. Yet when impossible things turn out to exist, the psychological effect can be enormous. Awe and fear arrive before strategy has time to settle. This does not mean technology alone decided events. It means that rumor itself became part of the encounter. The invaders were preceded by stories that stretched belief, and belief matters when whole empires are deciding how to respond. Moctezuma responded with gifts that only fed Spanish greed. When the emperor sent rich offerings to the newcomers, he may have intended several things at once. He may have been displaying power, managing tension, or signaling controlled welcome while keeping the strangers at a distance. In many diplomatic traditions, lavish gifts can establish status and shape the tone of encounter. But in this case, the effect was dangerous. What the Spaniards saw was not merely courtesy. They saw proof of wealth on a scale that sharpened desire. Gold and finely crafted objects did not calm their ambitions. They intensified them. This is one of history's bitter ironies. An act that may have been meant to contain the situation helped persuade the invaders that the world ahead was worth even greater risk. Rich gifts became fuel. They fed curiosity, avarice, and the conviction that immense treasure lay deeper inland. What was meant as a gesture of imperial power was read instead as an invitation to pursue more and more ruthlessly. Hospitality became one of the conquest's most dangerous moments. There are times in history when courtesy itself becomes a trap, and this is one of them. In many political cultures, receiving guests with dignity can project control, civilization, and confidence. It can also buy time and preserve order while a ruler judges the situation. Yet in this case, the act of admitting the newcomers into the capital created extraordinary risk. Once inside, they were no longer distant strangers who could be observed from afar. They were physically present at the center of imperial power. They could see the city, measure its routines, study its weaknesses, and position themselves close to the emperor himself. Hospitality made proximity possible, and proximity changed everything. What should have demonstrated confidence ended up granting dangerous access. That reversal is part of what makes the story so haunting. Sometimes history does not turn on open battle first. Sometimes it turns when welcome is offered, because once the wrong guests cross the threshold, the whole world inside begins to change. The emperor received Cortés in a city of ceremony and tension. Their meeting remains one of the most charged scenes in the conquest because it brought together two men whose worlds touched only through danger, calculation, and spectacle. The setting mattered enormously. This was not a roadside conference or a hurried conversation at a frontier outpost. It unfolded in the imperial capital, amid ritual, status, and public meaning. Every movement and every gift carried significance. The emperor had to appear composed and sovereign. Cortés had to appear respectful while also measuring opportunity. Beneath the ceremony sat tension so thick it almost feels visible even now. Each side was studying the other, testing manners against ambition. To later generations, the scene has the quality of a slow-burning collision. Outwardly, it could appear formal and controlled. Inwardly, it was full of danger because neither side truly knew how the other would use what came next. The empire welcomed the strangers in splendor, while uncertainty stood beside every gesture. Soon, the ruler of an empire was a prisoner. Few reversals in world history are as startling. Moctezuma, who had ruled from the center of one of the great cities of his age, was seized and held under Spanish control inside his own capital. However exactly the pressure was applied in the moment, the result was extraordinary. A small foreign force managed to place the emperor under its power without first conquering the city around him. This was not merely dramatic, it was strategically devastating. A ruler's body can become political territory, and once that territory is taken, authority itself begins to warp. Subjects ask dangerous questions. Is the emperor still commanding, or merely speaking under coercion? Are old loyalties still intact if the sacred center can be touched so directly? The capture did not instantly hand the Spaniards full control, but it ruptured something essential. Imperial power depended on visibility, certainty, and command. Imprisoning the emperor turned all three into unstable things at once. Captivity hollowed out Aztec power from the very center. An empire can survive military losses at its edges more easily than it can survive confusion at its core. Once Moctezuma was held by the Spaniards, the damage spread beyond the walls around him. Authority itself became compromised. Orders no longer carried the same force if people suspected they were being spoken under duress. Ritual status no longer reassured in the same way if the ruler could be controlled by foreigners. The symbolism was devastating. The imperial center had not vanished, but it no longer felt secure. That kind of uncertainty can eat through a political order faster than open destruction because it affects judgment everywhere at once. Nobles, warriors, local leaders, and ordinary residents all had to interpret what this new reality meant. Was obedience still wise? Was resistance now necessary? Could the emperor still protect anyone if he could not protect himself? Conquest often begins by breaking confidence, and captivity did exactly that at the most sensitive point imaginable. Even before the siege, imperial authority was already shaking. By the time the final assault on Tenochtitlan began, the empire had already suffered deep political injury. This is important because it reminds us that collapse was not created by siege alone. Confidence in imperial leadership had been strained by the arrival of the Spaniards, the entry into the capital, the captivity of Moctezuma, and the growing sense that events were no longer unfolding according to the old expectations of order and command. In powerful states, authority often depends on the appearance of control almost as much as on force itself. Once that appearance cracks, tremors spread quickly. The Aztec world was already living inside those tremors. People could see that the center was unstable. They could feel that old certainties were failing. That meant the coming siege would strike a world already unsettled, not a perfectly intact system suddenly surprised by war. The battle for the city began after the battle for confidence had already been going badly. One hostage emperor changed the fate of millions. History can hinge on structures, systems, and long tensions, but sometimes it also narrows around a single human body. Once Moctezuma became a hostage, the balance of the entire region shifted. His captivity altered decision-making inside the capital, damaged imperial prestige across the wider network of subject and allied communities, and created a crisis no one could easily resolve. He was not just an individual. He embodied the center of a political and sacred order. To seize him was to seize a crucial piece of that order without yet destroying the whole. The consequences radiated outward. Some people hesitated. Some grew furious. Some saw weakness where they had once seen certainty. That change in perception affected the future of cities, armies, families, and generations far beyond the palace itself. It is astonishing to think about. The imprisonment of one emperor became one of the turning points through which an empire stumbled, a capital burned, and the history of the Americas changed. Violence erupted in the capital while Cortés was away. Just when the occupation of Tenochtitlan already felt unstable, the whole situation grew even more dangerous because Cortés left the city. He had learned that another Spanish force had arrived on the coast under Pánfilo de Narváez, sent to stop him. So he marched out to deal with that threat and left Pedro de Alvarado in command inside the capital. That decision mattered enormously. It meant the city was left with a volatile garrison, rising suspicion, and leaders on both sides trying to read intentions that were growing darker by the day. The delicate balance that had held since Moctezuma's captivity was now under even greater strain. Without Cortés there to manage negotiations, bluff or improvise, mistrust sharpened. The Spaniards feared revolt. The Mexica feared treachery. Tenochtitlan had become a place where one bad decision could ignite the whole city. And while Cortés was away, that is exactly what happened. The occupation tipped from tension into catastrophe. A massacre during a festival turned fear into open war. The breaking point came during a major religious celebration, when many Mexica nobles and participants gathered in ceremonial dress inside the sacred precinct. While the festival was underway, Alvarado and his men attacked. The exact justifications were disputed from the start, with Spaniards later claiming fear of an uprising and indigenous accounts describing a brutal assault on unarmed celebrants. What is certain is that the effect was explosive. A gathering that should have been filled with music, movement, and sacred ritual became a scene of sudden slaughter. For the people of Tenochtitlan, this was not just violence. It was desecration, betrayal, and proof that the occupiers could not be trusted inside the city's holiest spaces. Any remaining possibility of uneasy coexistence shattered. Suspicion turned into rage, and rage into collective action. After that bloodshed, the conflict could no longer be contained through hostage rule or uneasy diplomacy. The capital moved toward open war with terrible speed. Tenochtitlan rose against its occupiers with terrifying force. Once the city erupted, the Spaniards discovered what it meant to face a great capital fighting for itself. Tenochtitlan was not a passive backdrop to conquest. It was crowded, organized, angry, and suddenly alive with resistance. Warriors struck from rooftops, streets, and waterways. Stones, darts, and spears rained down. The urban landscape itself seemed to turn hostile, because every causeway, every canal crossing, and every familiar route now favored defenders who knew the city intimately. The occupiers had once seemed bold for taking the emperor hostage in his own capital. Now that boldness looked dangerously thin. They were surrounded by a population whose patience had snapped. This reversal gives the story much of its raw power. For a moment, the conquest appeared ready to collapse entirely under the weight of urban fury. The city that had been entered with ceremony now answered with violence on every side, showing that imperial splendor could also become ferocious resistance when pushed too far. The Spaniards suddenly found themselves trapped inside the city. Conquerors often imagine that occupying a capital means securing control. In Tenochtitlan, the opposite became true. Once the uprising spread, the Spaniards were no longer masters of the situation. They were a small, foreign force enclosed within a vast, hostile city. The very place they had entered to dominate now felt like a trap closing around them. Streets became ambush zones. Open movement became dangerous. Food, safety, and communication all became harder to manage. The capital's watery design added to the danger, because the occupiers could not simply ride or march out freely, as if they were in an ordinary city on open ground. They were isolated in the middle of a population that wanted them gone. It is one of the most dramatic reversals in the whole campaign. Men who had gambled everything on audacity suddenly faced the possibility of being wiped out where they stood. They had captured the center, and then the center captured them. Moctezuma could no longer calm the storm around him. At one of the most tragic moments in the conquest, the emperor was brought forward in the hope that his presence and authority might quiet the rage of his people. That alone shows how desperate the Spaniards had become. they still believed his voice might restore order, or at least buy time. But the political world had changed too much. Captivity had drained his authority, and the massacre had pushed fury beyond the reach of ceremony. Whether people saw him as compromised, powerless, or simply unable to protect them anymore, the old bond had broken. Accounts differ on the precise details of his death, but the larger truth is devastatingly clear. He could no longer command the emotional center of the city he had once ruled. That failure was not merely personal. It marked the collapse of an entire political arrangement. The hostage emperor, once used as the occupier's shield, had ceased to function as one. After that, the road to disaster opened wider. The invaders fled by night across bloodied causeways. Eventually, staying inside the city became impossible. The Spaniards and their allies prepared a desperate escape under cover of darkness, hoping to slip out across the causeways before the defenders could fully react. But the city was awake to them. As the retreat unfolded, confusion, noise, and violence erupted all along the route. Men burdened with armor, weapons, and treasure stumbled in the dark. Gaps in the causeways became death traps. Canoes closed in from the waters. The retreat that may have been imagined as stealth quickly turned into chaos. This is one of the most cinematic moments in the entire story, but it is terrifying rather than triumphant. An invading force that had once entered the capital in confidence now fought just to escape it alive. The route outward was lined with panic, drowning, and attack. By the end, the night had become a nightmare of water, mud, cries, and blood, with the city striking back as they ran. La Noche Triste became one of conquest's darkest turning points. The retreat from Tenochtitlan passed into history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, and the name captures the emotional force of what happened. This was not just a battlefield setback. It was a humiliation, a collapse of confidence, and a revelation that the conquest could still fail completely. Large numbers of Spaniards and allied fighters were killed. Hard-won gains seemed to be dissolving into darkness and lake water. For Cortés and his men, the night exposed the cost of overreach. For the defenders, it offered proof that the invaders were not unstoppable after all. That is why this moment matters so much. It shattered the image of easy advance and replaced it with something harsher and more uncertain. The conquest was no longer a story of uninterrupted momentum. It had passed through ruin and nearly ended there. The later victory becomes more astonishing and more unsettling because it had first come so close to breaking altogether. Gold, armor, and men vanished into the lake. During the retreat, Lake Texcoco seemed to swallow the ambition of the invaders piece by piece. Men overloaded themselves with treasure, especially gold, and that choice proved deadly. Wealth that had glittered as the promise of conquest became weight-dragging bodies downward into dark water. Armor, which on land could offer protection, became deadly burden in a chaotic crossing. Horses, weapons, precious loot, and human lives disappeared into the lake together. There is something grimly symbolic about that image. The very riches that had helped drive the conquest now helped kill those trying to carry them away. The lake became a grave for greed as much as for men. This is one reason the retreat is remembered so vividly. It turns abstract motives into physical consequence. Desire becomes heaviness. Plunder becomes doom. In a single night, the waters around the capital did not just resist conquest. They consumed pieces of it, along with the men who believed they could escape richer. Survival that night kept the conquest alive. For all the death and chaos of the retreat, the crucial fact is that enough of the invading force escaped. That thin margin between destruction and survival changed everything that followed. If Cortés had died in the city, or if the remaining Spaniards and their allies had been annihilated on the causeways, the story of the conquest could have ended there. Instead, battered survivors reached safety. They had lost men, treasure, and prestige, but they had not lost the capacity to fight again. This is what makes the night so historically charged. It was not only a disaster, it was a survival event, and survival in history can matter more than victory in the moment. The retreat kept open the possibility of regrouping, rethinking, and returning. It turned a near-fatal blow into a terrible lesson rather than a final ending. The conquest crossed a knife edge that night, and somehow remained alive on the other side of it. Defeat did not end the invasion, it hardened it. Many campaigns would have broken under a blow like the retreat from Tenochtitlan. Instead, the defeat sharpened the invaders. It stripped away illusions, clarified the scale of resistance they faced, and forced a more methodical approach. Cortés and his allies had seen what happened when they tried to hold the capital without fully controlling the surrounding environment. They had learned how dangerous the causeways, canals, and population of the city could become when united against them. After such a loss, retreat to the coast might have seemed sensible. Yet the logic of conquest now worked in the opposite direction. Too much had already been risked. Too much blood had been shed. So the invasion became more determined, more organized, and more ruthless. This is one of the chilling patterns of history. A failed strike does not always weaken an aggressor's will. Sometimes it burns away hesitation and leaves behind something harder, colder, and more dangerous than before. Smallpox reached the valley and changed the balance of history. While war still raged, another force entered the story, silent at first, and then devastating. Smallpox reached the Valley of Mexico and spread into populations with no prior exposure to it. Unlike armies, it did not need supply lines, alliances, or speeches. It moved from body to body with terrifying indifference. This changed the balance of the conflict in ways that no commander fully controlled. The defenders of the Aztec world were already dealing with invasion, political rupture, and the aftermath of violence in the capital. Now they were hit by an epidemic that could strike homes, leadership, and military strength all at once. That is why the disease feels so historically chilling. It did not merely add suffering to a war already underway. It altered the conditions of that war. The conquest was no longer being fought only through strategy and battle. It was also being reshaped by a biological disaster moving faster than most people could understand. Disease killed fighters, nobles, workers, and hope alike. Smallpox did not choose its victims according to rank or role. That is part of what made it so destructive to a society under pressure. Warriors were lost, which weakened military capacity. Nobles were lost, which disrupted leadership and decision-making. Workers and farmers were lost, which damaged the basic systems that kept people fed and cities functioning. Families were struck inside their homes. Skilled hands disappeared. Knowledge vanished with the dead. In a crisis, every one of those losses matters, and together they can make a society feel as if the ground beneath it is dissolving. The epidemic attacked not only bodies, but continuity itself. Even people who survived would have lived among grief, fear, and uncertainty so intense, but morale must have suffered terribly. That is why it is fair to say hope was among the casualties. A people fighting to defend their world now had to do so while watching sickness cut through every layer of that world. The epidemic struck people with no immunity at all. In Europe, smallpox was already a known terror, but populations there had endured repeated exposure over generations. In central Mexico, the disease arrived as something far more catastrophic because people had no inherited background of immunity to soften its impact. That absence matters enormously. It meant the virus could move through communities with frightening efficiency, meeting bodies that had no learned defense against it. The result was not ordinary illness on a war-torn landscape. It was biological shock. People who had never seen such symptoms suddenly faced fever, weakness, pustules, disfigurement, and death spreading through families and neighborhoods. To those watching it happen, the disease must have felt almost supernatural in its speed and cruelty. This is one of the most heartbreaking dimensions of the conquest. The victims were not simply facing a familiar hardship made worse. They were encountering an entirely new disaster in the middle of invasion, without medicine, experience, or immunity strong enough to blunt the blow. Cuitlahuac ruled briefly before smallpox killed him too. After Moctezuma's fall, leadership passed to Cuitlahuac, a ruler associated with resistance at one of the most critical moments in the empire's struggle for survival. His rise mattered because the city needed firm command, military direction, and a figure around whom defenders could rally. For a brief moment, that change in leadership seemed to promise renewed determination against the invaders. But then smallpox cut across politics with terrible indifference. Cuitlahuac died after only a short reign, and with him vanished another chance for continuity, in a time when continuity mattered desperately. His death captures the pitiless way disease magnified the crisis. The empire was not only losing men in battle, it was losing rulers in rapid succession, each death bringing more instability to a world already shaken. A throne that should have projected endurance instead became a place of interruption and loss. That kind of repeated disruption can exhaust even a powerful state from within. The empire lost leaders just when it needed them most. Crises are survivable when institutions remain stable, and leadership can guide people through shock. The Aztec world had no such luxury in these months. It faced cascading political losses at the very moment when coherent direction was most necessary. Moctezuma was gone. Cuitlahuac followed. Other nobles and commanders were also vulnerable to disease, war, and chaos. This matters because empires do not defend themselves automatically. They rely on human beings to make decisions, maintain legitimacy, and coordinate action under pressure. When leaders disappear in quick succession, confusion spreads faster, rival claims become more dangerous, and ordinary people lose the sense that anyone truly holds the center. That does not mean resistance vanished. It means resistance had to continue in a world where continuity itself was breaking. The tragedy here lies partly in timing. Losses that would have been damaging in peace became catastrophic in crisis. The empire was being asked to survive, while its guiding hands kept falling away. Disease weakened resistance before the final siege even began. By the time the campaign entered its last phase, the defenders were not confronting the enemy in the condition they might once have been. The epidemic had already taken lives, shaken leadership, damaged labor, and spread fear. That means the final siege began against a background of prior weakening that must be remembered if we want to understand the scale of the tragedy. Tenochtitlan still resisted fiercely, but it did so after disease had already cut into the strength of the wider society around it. This is what makes the conquest feel so cruelly stacked. The city was not simply challenged by military force at full capacity on both sides. One side had already been thinned by an invisible assault before the decisive struggle fully tightened. The siege therefore unfolded over a population carrying recent wounds beyond the battlefield. History sometimes turns because armies meet. Here it also turned because one army, and the society behind it, had already been diminished before the longest fight truly began. Invisible microbes proved deadlier than steel in many places. Weapons are easy to remember because they are dramatic. They flash, strike, and leave visible wounds. Disease works differently. It moves unseen and often leaves devastation on a scale harder to narrate, because there is no single heroic moment attached to it. Yet in many parts of the conquest, microbes did more damage than swords. They killed more relentlessly, spread more widely, and disrupted more completely than battle alone ever could. This is one of the most sobering truths in the whole story. Men came to conquer with steel, but the deadliest companion of conquest often rode inside bodies, not in hands. The Aztec world faced destruction from enemies it could see and from enemies it could not. That second enemy was in some ways the more terrifying because courage, training, and determination offered little protection. You can meet a soldier in combat. You cannot challenge a virus to single combat. It simply enters, multiplies, and changes history without asking permission. The conquest was biological as well as military. To think of the fall of the Aztec Empire as only a sequence of battles is to miss something essential. It was also a biological collision between populations long separated from one another. When those worlds met, they did not exchange only goods, beliefs, and violence. They exchanged disease, and disease became one of the most powerful forces in the entire transformation. This gives the conquest a deeper and more unsettling dimension. Human intention mattered. Strategy mattered. Alliances mattered. But microbes operated alongside all of them, reshaping outcomes without loyalty to either side. That is why the event feels larger than a conventional war story. It was a military campaign unfolding inside an epidemiological disaster. The battlefield extended into homes, temples, palaces, and crowded streets where the sick lay suffering. The empire was not merely being attacked from outside. It was being biologically penetrated from within. The conquest, in that sense, was fought in blood, politics, and infection all at once. The epidemic tore through a crowded lake city with speed. Dense urban life can be glorious in peace and deadly in epidemic. Tenochtitlan's size, movement, and close human contact helped make it one of the great cities of its age. Those same qualities also created conditions in which smallpox could spread rapidly once it arrived. People lived, worked, traded, worshipped, and moved in close proximity. Families shared space. Markets gathered crowds. Water routes and streets linked neighborhoods in constant motion. In such a setting, contagion did not need to travel slowly. It could pass quickly through the living fabric of the city. That makes the image of epidemic Tenochtitlan especially haunting. A metropolis famed for energy and organization became a place where illness could race through the very networks that once sustained daily life. Urban greatness turned into epidemiological vulnerability. The city's density, normally a sign of its power, became one more reason suffering could multiply so rapidly once disease entered the heart of the lake-bound capital. The empire fought invaders while plague moved among its people. Perhaps the most harrowing thing of all is that these disasters did not arrive neatly, one after another. The Aztec world did not get to finish one crisis before beginning the next. War and epidemic overlapped. Resistance had to continue while the sick suffered, while leaders died, while households grieved, and while fear spread through the same communities being asked to fight. That layering of catastrophe is what gives this part of the story its overwhelming force. The empire was defending itself against a coalition of enemies at the very same time that disease was unmaking strength from the inside. Every choice became harder. Every loss became heavier. Every victory, even if won locally, existed in a landscape where the plague kept moving. This is why the fall of the empire feels so devastating even beyond the battlefield. It was not only defeated in combat, It was forced to endure simultaneous forms of ruin, each making the other worse, until survival itself became terribly difficult. Cuauhtémoc became the young ruler of a collapsing world. When Cuauhtémoc rose to power, he did not inherit a stable throne, a confident court, or a city at peace. He inherited smoke, grief, disease, hunger, and the knowledge that the enemy would return. That is what makes his accession so gripping. He was not stepping into ceremony. He was stepping into emergency. Everything around him had already been shaken. The old order had fractured. The capital had endured violence, retreat, and epidemic. Yet in that bleak moment, a new ruler still had to stand before the people as the embodiment of resolve. Cuauhtémoc was young, but youth here does not suggest softness. It suggests the shock of a generation being forced forward by catastrophe. He became the face of endurance when endurance itself was in doubt. History often remembers emperors at the height of glory. This one came to the throne at the edge of ruin, which makes his role feel more human and far more tragic. He chose resistance when surrender might have seemed easier. There comes a point in many great sieges when surrender begins to whisper its logic. The city is suffering. Supplies are shrinking. Enemies are tightening their grip. Every day promises more death. Under such conditions, resistance can begin to look less like courage and more like torment prolonged. Yet Cuauhtémoc did not yield. That choice matters because it tells us something profound about what was being defended. This was not only a collection of buildings or a political office. It was a sacred capital, a living center, and the core of a world people still believed worth fighting for. To continue under such pressure meant accepting the cost in full view. The easier path, at least on the surface, may have been submission. The harder path was to stand with the city as it endured one of the worst ordeals in its history. That decision gave the final defense its fierce moral intensity and its lasting emotional power. The final emperor defended Tenochtitlan street by street. The last defense of the capital was not some distant command issued from safety. It unfolded within the city's own neighborhoods, causeways, canals, and sacred spaces, where every advance had to be answered in close, brutal struggle. Under Cuauhtémoc, resistance became intensely local. This alley, this crossing, this stretch of stone, this cluster of homes. The fight narrowed into pieces of the city that people knew by memory and daily use. That gives the story its terrible intimacy. A capital can sound abstract from afar, but a street is never abstract. A street is where people lived, traded, worshipped, and walked. To defend a city street by street is to watch ordinary places become sites of extraordinary desperation. The emperor's role in that struggle matters because it reveals a ruler bound to the fate of his city in the most direct way possible. He did not rule over the last battle from a distance. He lived inside it. Canoes and barricades turned the city into a battlefield maze. In the final struggle, Tenochtitlan became almost impossible to fight through cleanly. The defenders used the city's watery structure with great skill, and the result was a battlefield that felt less like open war and more like a trap-filled maze. Canoes moved through canals and around flanks with speed. Barricades blocked routes, forced delays, and created killing points where attackers could be exposed from several directions at once. Progress became slow, disorienting, and dangerous. An advance that looked promising one moment could collapse into confusion the next. This is one reason the siege feels so vivid to imagine. It was not an orderly march into a defeated city. It was a struggle through a place designed by human intelligence and natural setting to complicate every enemy movement. The capital fought back through its own shape. Water, stone, and improvised defenses combined to create a shifting urban labyrinth where local knowledge could become as deadly as any weapon in hand. Every canal became a front line in the siege. In many cities, a canal is a route of trade or transport. In besieged Tenochtitlan, each one became something harsher. The waterways dividing neighborhoods and crossing the capital turned into lines of contact where movement, supply, and survival were constantly contested. A canal could stop an advance, expose a crossing, or permit a sudden strike from unexpected direction. That changed the texture of the fighting completely. War was no longer confined to broad approaches or ceremonial centers. It spread into the city's living network of water. Men had to think about attack and defense in 3 dimensions, with danger coming from open routes on land and narrow channels beside them. The result must have been exhausting. No space felt safely behind the line, because the line itself kept shifting with the water. This is part of what makes the siege so singular. The capital did not simply contain battle. Its waterways multiplied battle, turning urban design into a relentless map of conflict. The defenders fought from rooftops, temples, bridges, and water. What makes the defense of Tenochtitlan feel so fierce is the sheer variety of positions from which resistance came. Attackers were not facing a single formed line standing on open ground. They were facing fighters using elevation, choke points, sacred structures, and waterways to their advantage. From rooftops came missiles and sudden strikes. From temple heights came commanding views and symbolic defiance. From bridges came desperate contests over passage. From the water came mobility, harassment, and surprise. That range of fighting positions tells you how completely the whole city had been drawn into war. Defense was no longer limited to one specialized part of the population in one specialized place. The city itself had become an active instrument of resistance. Every layer of urban space offered some way to oppose the enemy. This makes the struggle feel alive in all directions. The defenders were not simply holding territory. They were using every surface and level of their city to fight for it. Hunger became one of the siege's cruelest weapons. Not all siege warfare kills by the sword. Some of it kills by waiting. As the pressure on Tenochtitlan tightened, food became scarcer, and scarcity can wound a city in ways even battle cannot. Hunger weakens the body, clouds the mind, undermines morale, and turns daily life into a long crisis without relief. That is why it was such a cruel weapon. It did not arrive in a single dramatic blow. It pressed inward hour by hour. Parents would have watched children grow weaker. Fighters would have entered combat with less strength than before. Ordinary acts of survival would have become heavy with desperation. The city was being asked not only to resist attack, but to do so while food slipped out of reach. In that sense, starvation became part of the enemy's strategy, whether carried by direct intention or siege effect. A capital famed for abundance was slowly driven toward want, and that reversal deepens the tragedy of its final months immeasurably. Drinking water itself became a desperate problem. A city surrounded by water can sound secure until you remember that not all water can be safely drunk. During the siege, one of the most terrible pressures on Tenochtitlan was the struggle to secure fresh water. The city depended on systems that could be disrupted, and once those lifelines were threatened, thirst became a new kind of enemy inside the walls. This matters because the need for water is merciless. Food can sometimes be stretched. Water cannot. The body demands it quickly, and panic grows when it seems uncertain. In such a setting, every day of disrupted access would have added to exhaustion, fear, and physical collapse. The city's lake setting, which had once supported its grandeur, now took on a bitter irony. Water was everywhere, yet safe water became desperately hard to obtain. That makes the siege feel even harsher. The defenders were not only being attacked and starved, they were being pushed toward thirst in the middle of their watery world. The city was slowly cut apart, block by block. The fall of Tenochtitlan did not come in one overwhelming moment that instantly shattered everything. It came through repeated pressure, local collapse, and the steady reduction of urban space. Neighborhood by neighborhood, crossing by crossing, the city was carved down. That block by block quality is important because it makes the destruction feel slower, heavier, and more exhausting than a single dramatic defeat. Each lost section would have meant more than territory. It would have meant homes abandoned, routes severed, and familiar places transformed into occupied ground. People inside the city would have felt the world shrinking around them in practical, visible ways. Safe movement narrowed. Opportunities to regroup diminished. The capital was not simply attacked from outside. It was progressively disassembled from within. This gives the siege its crushing rhythm. Each day might still contain courage, resistance, and local success, but the larger pattern kept tightening. The city was being taken apart in pieces, and everyone inside could feel it happening. Cuauhtémoc fought on long after defeat seemed certain. There is a point in most lost causes when survival, not victory, becomes the clearest imaginable outcome. By then, the walls of hope have thinned. Allies are exhausted. Supplies are failing. The enemy's momentum is obvious. And yet some leaders continue, not because they expect a miracle, but because surrender at that moment feels like the abandonment of everything they have been asked to embody. Cuauhtémoc seems to have reached that point and moved beyond it. He continued the defense when collapse was no longer difficult to imagine. That is one reason his reputation endured. To stand on while the end approaches is a different kind of courage from the confidence of early battle. It is colder, harder, and lonelier. The city around him was shrinking, suffering, and dying, but he did not rush towards submission simply because the likely outcome had become grim. He carried resistance past the threshold where many would have judged it already finished. Cortés built brigantines to bring war onto the lake. One of the most striking things about the final campaign is how carefully Cortés adapted after earlier disaster. He had already learned that trying to defeat Tenochtitlan without proper control of the lake was a grave mistake. So he turned preparation itself into strategy. Brigantines, small sailing vessels built in parts and assembled in the Valley of Mexico, became his answer to the city's watery environment. Their very existence reveals astonishing determination and logistical ambition. Timber, labor, transport, planning, and engineering all had to align for these ships to become real so far from the sea. This was not improvisation on a whim. It was deliberate transformation of the battlefield. Cortés was preparing to fight the capital not only on roads and causeways, but on the water that sustained and protected it. The brigantines therefore symbolize something larger than craft alone. They show a campaign learning from failure and returning in a more dangerous form than before. Those small ships shattered the city's watery defenses. Size can be deceptive in war. The brigantines were not massive floating fortresses, yet their effect on the struggle around Tenochtitlan was enormous. Once launched onto the lake, they challenged one of the defenders' key advantages: mobility by canoe and the ability to use the surrounding waters as a shield, supply route, and space of maneuver. A smaller vessel in the right environment can still transform the balance of power, and that is what happened here. The ships made it harder for defenders to move freely, harder to launch harassment from the water, and harder to preserve the city's sense of protection within the lake basin. They did not merely add more attackers. They changed the geometry of the siege. That is why they matter so much. A capital that had once seemed naturally integrated with its watery surroundings now faced enemies capable of contesting those surroundings directly. The protective water around the city had become another battlefield the defenders could no longer dominate. Spanish steel mattered, but control of water mattered more. It is easy to remember swords, armor, and the brutal edge of close combat, yet the deeper lesson of the siege may be that control of the environment outweighed individual weapons. Steel helped in fighting, but water shaped the larger possibilities of war. Whoever controlled the lake approaches, the canal movement, and the transport routes around the capital could alter the entire tempo of the campaign. This is what makes the conquest of Tenochtitlan so distinctive. The decisive struggle did not turn only on who had sharper blades. It turned on who could master the strange union of city and lake that defined the battlefield. Once the attackers gained stronger command over the waters around the capital, the defenders lost more than tactical freedom. They lost a fundamental advantage built into the world they knew best. The fight became less about isolated clashes and more about the slow erosion of mobility, access, and space. In that larger sense, water determined far more than steel ever could. Horses were terrifying, but brigantines were decisive. Horses made a deep impression in the conquest. They carried shock, speed, height, and fear, especially in early encounters where their unfamiliarity added to their effect. Yet, in the final struggle for Tenochtitlan, something else mattered even more. The city's lake setting limited the usefulness of cavalry in crucial ways, because water, canals, narrow crossings, and broken urban space could blunt the advantage of mounted movement. Brigantines, by contrast, answered the actual shape of the battlefield. They could move across the lake, challenge canoe traffic, support assaults, and tighten control around the island capital. That is why they proved decisive. They were not as visually dramatic as a charging horse, but they fit the problem better. This contrast tells us something important about warfare. The most frightening weapon is not always the most important one. Sometimes victory belongs to the tool that best matches the environment. And in the case of Tenochtitlan, that tool floated rather than galloped. Causeways became kill zones during the long assault. Those raised roads linking the city to the mainland had once served movement, trade, and connection. During the siege, they became places of concentrated danger where every advance exposed men to attack from multiple directions. A causeway is useful in peace because it provides passage. In war, that same narrowness can become lethal. There is little room to spread out. Water flanks both sides. Broken sections interrupt motion. Defenders can target movement with terrible focus. That is why these approaches turned into kill zones. Anyone pushing forward had to do so under constant pressure, often while trying to repair crossings or protect themselves from missiles and sudden counterattack. The struggle along these routes must have felt exhausting and repetitive in the worst sense. Gains were costly, and the same ground could become deadly again and again. The city's approaches were no longer lifelines. They had become funnels of blood where progress could be measured in yards and paid for in lives. Each advance had to be fought for again and again. One of the most exhausting things about the siege was the way success refused to stay secure. Attackers could gain ground, only to lose it under counterattack. A route could be opened, then contested once more. A defensive obstacle could be cleared, then replaced by new resistance. This repeated struggle gave the whole campaign a grinding rhythm. Victory did not arrive as one clean breakthrough. It had to be dragged forward through repeated contests over the same damaged spaces. That makes the siege feel less like a heroic rush and more like attrition in its rawest form. Every step cost effort. Every gain invited response. The city was not passively awaiting its end. it kept forcing the attackers to earn progress over and over. This matters because repetition wears people down psychologically as much as physically. Men begin to wonder whether any gain will hold. In that atmosphere, endurance becomes as important as bravery, and often far harder to sustain. The attackers destroyed bridges, then rebuilt them under fire. Siege warfare around Tenochtitlan demanded a brutal kind of engineering in motion. The attackers sometimes had to break structures to deny defenders their use, yet they also needed crossings to continue their own advance. That meant bridges and gaps became part of a grim cycle of destruction and repair. To rebuild under fire is one of the most nerve-wracking acts in any battle. It requires labor in exposed places, patience under attack, and the willingness to focus on construction while death is close at hand. This detail makes the siege feel intensely physical. It was not only a matter of combat skill. It was a matter of hauling, placing, stabilizing, and crossing in conditions of chaos. War here looked like fighters, but it also looked like men trying to make passage possible in a broken city, while defenders did everything they could to stop them. Even infrastructure became part of the duel, and every repaired crossing was a contested victory. Victory came through grinding siege warfare, not one grand charge. Stories of conquest often prefer a single decisive scene, one dramatic charge, one final clash, one kingly moment of collapse. Tenochtitlan did not fall that way. It was taken through long, bitter, exhausting siege warfare. The attackers had to isolate, pressure, erode, and repeatedly assault a city that refused to yield quickly. This makes the ending more historically honest and, in some ways, more horrifying. Grand charges are terrible, but they are fast. Sieges can stretch suffering across weeks and months, wearing down everyone inside. That is exactly what gives this campaign its bleak power. Victory did not burst into being in one shining moment. It accumulated out of ruined neighborhoods, broken routes, starvation, thirst, close fighting, and relentless pressure. The city died slowly. That slowness matters because it strips away any illusion of clean triumph. What happened was not a single heroic stroke. It was the prolonged destruction of a great capital by methodical force. Tenochtitlan fell by exhaustion as much as attack. By the end, the city was not simply overwhelmed by direct blows. It was worn down. Its people had endured hunger, thirst, disease, grief, repeated combat, shrinking space, and the psychological burden of seeing familiar worlds collapse around them. Exhaustion therefore became a force in its own right. Bodies fail after enough deprivation. Minds fail after enough terror and uncertainty. Communities lose capacity when every day is another struggle just to remain standing. This is what makes the fall so devastating. The capital was not only stormed, it was drained. That distinction matters because it reveals a different kind of conquest, one that does not rely only on striking power, but on making continued resistance harder with each passing day until the city can no longer function as itself. The attackers kept pressing, but exhaustion did much of the final work. Tenochtitlan did not simply lose a battle. It was forced past the limits of human endurance and broke there. The conquest ended with smoke, famine, wreckage, and silence. When the fighting finally ended, what remained was not the glittering city that had astonished visitors on first approach. What remained was devastation. Smoke hung over damaged spaces where life had once moved with confidence. Famine had hollowed people before death or capture reached them. Wreckage marked streets, temples, houses, and causeways. And after the noise of battle, there must also have been stretches of terrible silence, the kind that follows catastrophe when a living city has been broken. That ending matters because it resists any easy language of triumph. A magnificent capital had not simply changed hands. It had been wrecked at the center of a civilizational upheaval. The beauty, order, and energy that had once defined it were buried under suffering and ruin. This is why the fall of Tenochtitlan continues to haunt history. The conquest did not close with celebration worthy of the city that died. It closed with absence, hunger, smoke, and the terrible quiet left behind. The city finally fell on an August day in 1521. On the 13th of August in 1521, the struggle for Tenochtitlan reached its terrible end. That date matters because it marks more than the capture of a city. It marks the collapse of an imperial center that had seemed, not long before, dazzling, sacred, and formidable. By then, the defenders had endured siege, starvation, disease, thirst, and relentless attack. What finally ended was not only military resistance, but the last fragile hope that the capital might somehow survive as the heart of its old world. When the city fell, the event must have felt both sudden and long prepared, like a final stone giving way after months of cracking pressure. Whole generations of memory, ritual, and authority converged on that single day. Historians can name it with precision, but the human reality behind it is harder to contain. It was the day an empire's center stopped being itself, and history turned in full view. Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape by canoe. The final emperor did not end his struggle on a throne, surrounded by ceremony. He was captured on the water while trying to flee by canoe, still moving through the same lake world that had shaped the city's rise and fall. There is something deeply symbolic in that image. The last ruler of the empire, not in ritual splendor, but in motion, in danger, still seeking some path through collapse. His capture mattered immediately because it removed the living figure around whom continued resistance might still gather. But it also mattered emotionally. The moment feels like the closing scene of an age. A ruler who had stood for defiance in the city's last agony was finally taken in the waters around the broken capital. Even in defeat, the scene remains vivid because it is so specific and human. The empire did not end in abstraction. It ended in a boat on a lake, with one man still trying to escape disaster. The fall ended the empire, but not indigenous resistance. It is important not to imagine the fall of Tenochtitlan as a magical moment when all resistance vanished at once. The imperial center was destroyed, yes, but indigenous opposition, adaptation, and struggle continued in many forms afterward. Some communities resisted Spanish power directly in later confrontations. Others negotiated, delayed, preserved traditions, or found quieter ways to endure under new conditions. That is one reason this history remains so compelling. It refuses to fit into a neat ending. Empires can fall in a day, but peoples do not simply disappear because a capital has been taken. The political map changed dramatically, yet the human landscape remained full of memory, will, and refusal. To understand the aftermath properly, we have to resist the idea of instant finality. The conquest shattered one order, but it did not erase indigenous agency. Even after the great city was broken, survival itself could become a form of resistance, and many communities continued that struggle in ways both visible and deeply stubborn. Tenochtitlan was ruined, then rebuilt as colonial Mexico City. One of the most astonishing transformations in this entire story is what happened next. The conquered capital was not left untouched as a fallen ruin, nor was it simply replaced somewhere else. It was broken apart and then used as the foundation for a new colonial city. Over time, Mexico City rose directly on the site where Tenochtitlan had stood. That means the old world was not only destroyed, it was buried beneath the new one, physically and symbolically. Streets changed. Institutions changed. Languages of power changed. Yet the ground beneath those changes still belonged to the old capital. This makes the city's afterlife feel almost ghostly. The conquerors did not turn away from the place. They claimed it, remade it, and built their own order on top of its remains. Modern Mexico City therefore carries a layered identity from the very beginning. Colonial above, indigenous below, with the memory of the lake city still haunting the foundations of the metropolis that followed. Temples were dismantled as churches and palaces rose. Conquest does not only seize land, it also reorders meaning. In the ruins of Tenochtitlan, sacred and political space was transformed with deliberate force. Temples that had once anchored the ceremonial life of the capital were dismantled, and in their place rose churches, palaces, and administrative buildings of the new colonial order. Stones were reused, but the meaning of those stones was being forcibly redirected. What had once supported one sacred universe would now support another. That makes this transformation especially powerful to imagine. The conquerors were not merely building because they needed shelter. They were announcing a new hierarchy of faith and authority in the most visible way possible. Build over the old center, and you proclaim that the old world has been subordinated. Yet the old stones remained inside the new structures, and that creates a haunting continuity. Even as the colonial city rose, it literally stood upon the material remains of the civilization it was trying to replace. A world capital became the foundation of New Spain. Before the conquest, Tenochtitlan was already a capital of enormous reach and sophistication. After the conquest, that same location became the central base of Spanish colonial power in mainland North America. This shift is one of the great geopolitical transformations of the early modern world. A city that had once organized tribute, warfare, and ritual for an indigenous empire was repurposed into the administrative heart of New Spain. From that new center, colonial authority would spread across vast territories. Officials, clergy, merchants, and settlers would all move through a place whose importance had not vanished, only changed hands. That is what makes the transition so striking. The conquerors did not inherit an empty field. They took over an already powerful center and redirected its strategic position toward a different empire. The capital's importance survived its fall, but in a radically altered form. A city that had ruled one world became the engine room for another, with consequences stretching far beyond the valley. The conquest began centuries of colonial rule in central Mexico. What happened in the early 16th century did not end with the battlefield. It opened the door to a long colonial era that would shape central Mexico for centuries. New institutions, new systems of labor, new legal structures, and new religious authorities were imposed over older foundations. This matters because the conquest was not merely an episode of destruction. It was the beginning of a sustained project of domination that would reach into daily life, property, family, belief, and memory across generations. That long duration gives the fall of the Aztec Empire such weight. A short campaign produced an enduring order. People born long after the siege would still live under systems made possible by its outcome. The conquest therefore belongs to the history of immediate catastrophe and to the history of long control. It altered not only who ruled, but how life itself would be organized in the centuries that followed, from the village to the city to the deepest levels of social identity. The old empire's wealth was redirected into a global empire. After the conquest, wealth that had once flowed toward the Aztec center no longer served the same political world. Tribute, labor, land, and later mineral riches were increasingly drawn into Spanish imperial networks that stretched far beyond Mexico. This is one of the great shifts in scale that makes the story so extraordinary. Resources once tied to a regional imperial system became part of a transoceanic empire linking the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. The redirection was not only economic, it was civilizational. Wealth now helped sustain crown authority, imperial warfare, missionary expansion, and commercial exchange across the globe. That means the fall of Tenochtitlan belongs not only to Mexican history, but to world history. A local collapse fed a planetary system. What had been gathered for one capital would now help empower another kind of imperial reach altogether. The treasure of a fallen world did not vanish. It changed direction, and the map of power changed with it. Silver, faith, language, and disease followed conquest's wake. Military victory is only the beginning of what conquest carries behind it. In the aftermath came extraction, conversion, linguistic change, and continuing waves of disease, all moving through the newly reordered landscape. Silver would become one of the great engines of colonial wealth. Christian institutions would expand across the region, reshaping sacred life with force and persuasion. Spanish language and law would spread through administration and power. Disease would continue to cut through communities already battered by conquest. Taken together, these forces reveal how deep the transformation ran. This was not merely a new flag above an old city. It was a remaking of economy, belief, speech, and survival itself. The wake of conquest, therefore, looks less like a single road and more like a flood, carrying different kinds of change at once. Some were material, some were spiritual, some were biological. All of them left marks. The battlefield ended, but the larger process of upheaval only widened from there. The fall of the Aztec Empire became a world-changing event. Some historical events matter mainly to one region. This one radiated outward across continents. The fall of the Aztec Empire altered the balance of power in the Americas, strengthened Spanish imperial expansion, reshaped Atlantic history, and fed connections that linked Europe, the New World, and beyond. That is why the event feels so large. It began in a specific place, among specific peoples, but its consequences traveled astonishing distances. Trade systems changed. Colonial ambitions expanded. Missionary movements deepened. The wealth and strategic importance of New Spain helped reshape imperial competition on a global scale. This is one of the great reminders that world history often turns through intensely local suffering. The fall of one city and the destruction of one imperial order helped build another whose reach stretched across oceans. That does not make the event abstract or less human. It makes it more sobering. The grief of one place became part of a transformation that changed the wider world. Indigenous allies helped win the victory Spain later claimed. One of the deepest ironies in this history is that Spain later celebrated the conquest as its own triumph, even though the victory had depended heavily on indigenous allies. Thousands of local fighters marched, scouted, carried supplies, and fought in the campaigns that brought down the empire. Without them, the Spaniards likely could not have succeeded. Yet later, memory often flattened that complexity into a simpler tale of European conquest. That distortion matters because it hides the real political texture of the conflict. Many indigenous peoples entered the struggle with their own reasons, their own hopes, and their own expectations about what defeating Tenochtitlan might bring. Wah! Some sought freedom from Aztec domination. Some sought advantage against rivals. Few could have fully imagined the colonial future that would emerge. The result is a victory layered with bitter contradiction. People who helped destroy one empire often found themselves living under another, while the new rulers increasingly claimed the story as if they had won it alone. The conquest survives in both Spanish letters and indigenous memory. The fall of the Aztec Empire reaches us through more than one channel, and that gives the story unusual richness and tension. Spanish conquerors wrote letters, reports, and justifications meant to explain, glorify, or defend what they had done. Indigenous communities preserved memory through oral traditions, pictorial records, later written accounts, and inherited understandings of catastrophe. These different forms of remembrance do not simply repeat one another. They carry different emotional weight, different priorities, and different truths about what mattered. That is why the conquest still feels alive in the historical record. It is not frozen inside one official version. It survives in competing memories, in voices that praise, mourn, justify, condemn, or endure. This layered survival matters because it lets us see conquest not as a neat, finished tale, but as a continuing argument about what happened and what it meant. History lives longest when many memories refuse to let one version fully win. Codices and chronicles tell the fall in very different voices. When we study the conquest, we encounter more than one kind of testimony. European-style chronicles often narrate events through prose, sequence, and individual action. Indigenous codices and related traditions may communicate through pictorial symbolism, condensed scenes, memory, and communal framing. These are not just different containers for the same story. They are different ways of seeing. One may emphasize strategy, royal service, and personal daring. Another may emphasize destruction, mourning, sacred disruption, or the suffering of the people. That contrast is fascinating because it reminds us that no event arrives in history untouched by perspective. The fall of Tenochtitlan exists in voices that do not merely disagree over details. They differ in emotional center. They differ in what counts as the real drama. To read them side by side is to feel the conquest splitting into multiple realities at once. The same catastrophe can become victory in one telling and world-ending grief in another. The story is not simple triumph, but catastrophe and survival. If this history is reduced to a tale of brilliant conquest, something essential is lost. The fall of the Aztec Empire was certainly dramatic, but it was not a clean triumph in any human sense worth admiring without hesitation. It was also catastrophe, marked by siege, famine, epidemic, destruction, and the collapse of a great urban world. At the same time, it was not only catastrophe, because people survived it. Communities adapted. Languages endured. Memory endured. Families rebuilt lives under conditions no one would have chosen. That is what gives the story its full power. It contains conquest, but also grief. It contains destruction, but also persistence. The deeper you look, the less satisfying any simple label becomes. This is not a story that belongs entirely to victors or entirely to the dead. It belongs to the shattered living as well, to those who carried fragments of a fallen world forward and made survival part of the history too. Aztec culture endured even after imperial power was broken. Political collapse does not erase a civilization in an instant. The empire ended, but many elements of the culture that had flourished within and beyond it continued in transformed ways. Language persisted. Foodways persisted. Craft traditions, local memory, naming practices, and inherited forms of knowledge continued through families and communities living under colonial rule. This endurance matters because conquest often tries to present itself as total, as if victory on the battlefield means complete replacement of what came before. The reality is more complicated and, in many ways, more remarkable. People carry culture in daily acts, in speech, in ceremony, in taste, in memory, and in how they teach children to understand the world. Those things can bend without vanishing. That does not lessen the violence of the conquest. It reveals the strength of the people who survived it. Even after imperial authority had been shattered, cultural life did not simply go dark. It changed shape, persisted, and remained part of the living fabric of Mexico. Nahuatl voices still echo through the history of the conquest. One of the most moving aspects of this story is that the language of the conquered world did not fall silent. Nahuatl continued to be spoken, written, and preserved, and through it, many indigenous perspectives on the conquest have reached later generations. That matters enormously. Without Nahuatl voices, the history would tilt even more heavily toward conquerors who were eager to explain themselves. With them, we hear grief, memory, interpretation, and endurance from within the society that suffered the catastrophe. Language here is more than communication. It is survival of viewpoint. It carries ways of naming, feeling, and remembering that Spanish sources alone cannot reproduce. This makes the conquest feel less like a monologue of victory and more like a contested archive of human experience. The echoes of Nahuatl remind us that the defeated were not voiceless. Their words remain, and because they remain, the past keeps speaking in tones conquest never fully managed to silence. The empire fell, but its descendants did not disappear. This point matters deeply because conquest narratives too often encourage the illusion that defeated peoples simply vanish into the background of history. That did not happen here. The descendants of the peoples who lived through the fall of the Aztec Empire are still present, still part of the living human story of Mexico and beyond. Communities endured, adapted, intermarried, resisted, remembered, and continued. This continuity changes how we should hear the whole history. The fall was not an ending after which only conquerors remained to tell the tale. It was a rupture inside a much longer survival. That makes the past feel closer, because the descendants of those who suffered, fought, and endured are not abstract. They are part of the present. Their existence is itself a correction to any story that treats conquest as perfect erasure. An empire was destroyed, yes, but the people connected to that world were not reduced to ruins. They moved through history, and their presence still reshapes how the event must be understood. Modern Mexico still stands on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. This is one of the most haunting facts of all. Modern Mexico City, one of the largest cities on Earth, occupies the ground where Tenochtitlan once rose from the lake. Beneath streets, buildings, traffic, and noise lie the remains of the old capital. That layered reality gives the conquest an almost physical presence in the modern world. The past is not only remembered in books, it is underfoot. Excavations still reveal walls, offerings, temples, and fragments of the vanished city, reminding everyone that the colonial and modern metropolis grew over a much older urban heart. There is something astonishing about that continuity of place. The same ground that once held causeways, markets, and imperial ceremony now holds avenues, towers, and millions of lives. Yet the older city has never fully disappeared. It continues to emerge from below, insisting on remembrance. In that way, the capital of the present still rests on the broken body of the capital that conquest destroyed. The fall still raises questions about courage, empire, and memory. What makes this story endure is not only what happened, but the questions it keeps asking. What does courage look like in catastrophe? Is it conquest, resistance, survival, or refusal? What does empire do to those it dominates? And what blindness does it create in those who build it? How should memory treat events that contain both admiration for human skill and horror at human destruction? The fall of the Aztec Empire does not sit quietly inside the past because it troubles easy answers. Cortés can seem bold and ruthless at once. Cuauhtémoc can seem doomed and magnificent at once. Indigenous allies can appear strategic and tragically misled at once. This complexity is why the conquest continues to fascinate. It offers no comfortable moral simplicity. Instead, it asks us to think harder about power, loyalty, and what history owes to the dead. Some events end when the battle ends. This one keeps speaking because the questions never quite stop. The end of the Aztec Empire was also a beginning. For the people who lived through it, the fall must often have felt like the end of everything familiar. In many ways, it was. A capital was destroyed. A ruling order collapsed. Sacred and political worlds were violently overturned. Yet history does not stop at endings. From that devastation came a new and deeply unequal colonial order, a transformed Mexico, and a future no one standing in the ruins could yet fully see. That is why this final truth feels so powerful. The conquest closed one chapter with smoke and grief, but it also opened another shaped by mixture, resistance, memory, survival, and reinvention. New identities would emerge. New struggles would emerge. New languages of belonging would emerge. None of that redeems the suffering that began the process, but it does explain why the story continues to matter so much. The end of an empire became the beginning of another world, and we are still living with the consequences of that beginning now. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the fall of the Aztec Empire. Tonight, we wandered through a world of lake waters, towering temples, crowded markets, and causeways stretching toward a city that once seemed almost impossible. We followed the arrival of strangers from across the sea. We watched old rivalries ignite, alliances shift, and a mighty empire begin to tremble. We stood at the heart of Tenochtitlan as ceremony gave way to siege, as the waters filled with canoes and war, and as one of the greatest cities on earth was slowly brought to ruin. And yet, this story was never only about destruction. It was also about endurance, about the people who resisted, the voices that survived, and the memory of a world that was never truly erased. Even now, beneath modern Mexico City, the old capital still lingers, buried in stone, in language, and in memory. As the night grows softer around you, you can let those distant images begin to drift. Let the lake grow still. Let the voices fade into the dark. Let the temples, the mountains, and the long roads across the water sink gently into silence. And if you're still awake, there will be another video waiting for you on the screen. Another slow journey into the past, ready whenever you are. And if you've enjoyed spending this time here, you might like to subscribe, leave a thought below, or return again for another evening of history and rest. But for now, just let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy, and let the last echoes of this ancient world fade softly into sleep. Sleep well, and good night.